Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that history tried desperately to erase. A world of women who dared to live without men in societies that said this was impossible, immoral, even dangerous. We're going to explore the lives of women who chose independence over marriage, solitude over submission, and autonomy over social approval, and discover that their stories are far more complex, fascinating, and inspiring than the dismissive label spinster or old maid ever suggested. Before we dive into these remarkable lives, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed scrolling through your phone? Perhaps lying on a comfortable mattress in an apartment you chose for yourself? Are you curled up on the couch in a space that is entirely yours, making your own decisions about how to spend your evening? Tonight I want you to appreciate that freedom, because as we journey through history, we'll discover just how radical and dangerous it was for women to live the kind of independent lives that many of us take for granted today. Wherever you are, I want you to dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's travel through centuries of women's history to discover the truth about women who lived alone without men. What if I told you that in medieval Europe there were entire communities of thousands of women living together without any male authority, running their own businesses, making their own rules, and creating one of history's most successful examples of women's economic independence? What if I told you that in ancient Rome there were women so wealthy and powerful that they chose to remain unmarried specifically to maintain control over their fortunes, and that Roman law had to create special categories to accommodate these independent women? What if I told you that in Edo period Japan there were divorced women who built thriving businesses and became so successful that they were courted by men wanting to marry into their wealth, completely inverting the expected power dynamic? What if I told you that throughout history societies have been terrified of women living without men, not because these women were sad and lonely, but because they were often too successful, too independent, too threatening to the social order that depended on women's subordination? According to research by Professor Judith Bennett from the University of Southern California, whose groundbreaking work on medieval women examines economic and social history, unmarried women in medieval Europe occupied a paradoxical position in society. They were simultaneously marginalized and essential, stigmatized and successful, restricted and remarkably free. Professor Bennett's analysis reveals that the stereotype of the pitiful spinster is largely a Victorian invention, a deliberate rewriting of history that erased centuries of women's economic agency and independence. The reality was far more complex and, in many ways, far more inspiring than the simplified narrative of women desperately seeking husbands would suggest. Think about that for a moment. You are going to spend tonight with me exploring in vivid, specific detail exactly how women throughout history created lives of meaning, purpose, and often remarkable success without marriage, how societies tried to control and stigmatize them, how they resisted and thrived anyway, and what their stories can teach us about autonomy, resilience, and the human need for independence. This isn't going to be a sad story of lonely women pining for husbands they never found. This is going to be a story of women who made choices, often difficult and costly choices, to preserve their freedom, their work, their passions, and their very selves. Tonight, I am going to take you inside the lives of real women who lived this reality, to understand exactly what their days looked like, what they sacrificed, what they gained, and why their stories matter profoundly to anyone who values freedom and self-determination. Let me tell you about Marjorie Kempe, and I want you to really imagine what her life was like, because her story will challenge everything you think you know about medieval women and independence. Marjorie was born around 1373 in King's Lynn, England, to a wealthy merchant family. She married, had 14 children, and by all accounts should have lived out her life as a respectable medieval wife and mother. But Marjorie had other plans. According to her autobiography, the first autobiography written in English, analysed extensively by Professor Lynn Staley from Colgate University, whose work on medieval women's writing examines female authorship and agency. Marjorie negotiated with her husband to live separately from him, essentially creating a medieval separation that allowed her to pursue her spiritual calling while technically remaining married. Marjorie's choice to live apart from her husband was revolutionary for her time. According to Professor Staley, she convinced her husband to take a vow of chastity, meaning they would remain married but live essentially as separate individuals, freeing Marjorie to travel, write, and pursue her spiritual visions without wifely duties. She spent years travelling across Europe and to Jerusalem completely alone, a woman without male protection in an era when this was considered both dangerous and scandalous. She was arrested multiple times for heresy, accused of being a lollard, questioned by bishops and archbishops. Yet she persisted, defending herself eloquently, and ultimately dying peacefully around 1438 after decades of the independent life she fought so hard to create. But here is what really fascinates me about Marjorie's story. According to Professor Staley's analysis, Marjorie was not trying to escape marriage because she hated her husband or her children. She was trying to claim space for her own spiritual and intellectual life, to be something more than just a wife and mother. Her autobiography reveals a woman who loved deeply, who was passionate and emotional, who had intense friendships with other women, who experienced profound spiritual visions that she believed were genuine communications with God. She was not a sad, lonely woman rejected by society. She was a woman who rejected the limitations society tried to impose on her, and in doing so, created one of the most remarkable literary and spiritual documents of the medieval period. Now let me tell you about a completely different kind of independent woman, one who lived in ancient Rome and used her wealth and legal acumen to remain unmarried despite intense social pressure. Her name was Hortensia, and she lived in the 1st century BCE during a period of civil war and political chaos. According to research by Professor Christina Milner from Barnard College, whose work on Roman women examines gender and political power, Hortensia was the daughter of a famous orator, and she inherited not just his wealth but his rhetorical skills. When she was still unmarried in her 20s, which was unusual for wealthy Roman women, she made a choice that would echo through history. In 42 BCE, the Roman triumvirs imposed a tax on wealthy women to fund their civil war, assuming that women, having no political voice, would simply pay without complaint. According to ancient sources analysed by Professor Milner, Hortensia did something unprecedented. She organised a protest of wealthy women, marched to the Forum, the centre of male political power where women rarely appeared, and delivered a public speech arguing that women should not be taxed without representation. Her speech, partially preserved in ancient texts, is one of the few examples of a Roman woman's political voice we still have. She argued that women, excluded from political power and denied the vote, should not bear the financial burden of men's wars. And remarkably, she won. The triumvirs reduced the tax significantly, a rare political victory for women in Roman history. But here is the crucial part of Hortensia's story that often gets overlooked. According to Professor Milner, Hortensia was able to take this radical public stand precisely because she was unmarried. Roman law gave unmarried women and widows far more legal autonomy than married women had. A married woman's property came under her husband's control, her actions required his permission, her public voice was essentially silenced. But an unmarried woman of means, especially one who had passed the age when marriage was expected, occupied a unique legal space. She could own property in her own name, conduct business, make legal decisions, and as Hortensia proved, engage in political activism that married women could not. Her choice to remain unmarried, whether deliberate or circumstantial, gave her a platform for political action that marriage would have denied her. According to research by Professor Suzanne Dixon from the University of Queensland, whose comprehensive work on Roman family structures examines women's legal and economic status. There were enough wealthy unmarried women in ancient Rome that legal categories had to be created to accommodate them. The term univira, meaning a woman married only once or not at all, carried both stigma and respect. These women were sometimes viewed with suspicion, their unmarried status seen as unnatural or even dangerous. Yet they were also essential to the Roman economy, managing estates, funding public works, patronizing artists and writers, and maintaining the family wealth across generations. Some of these women deliberately chose to remain unmarried after being widowed young, recognizing that remarriage would cost them the legal independence and economic control that widowhood had granted them. Let me tell you about the Beguines, because their story is one of the most remarkable examples of women's independence in all of medieval history, and it is a story that most people have never heard. The Beguines were communities of women, thousands of women, who lived together in medieval Europe starting in the 12th century, creating a way of life that was neither marriage nor the convent, but something entirely new. According to research by Professor Walter Simons from Dartmouth College, whose definitive work on Beguine communities examines their social and economic impact, at the height of the Beguine movement in the 13th and 14th centuries, there were cities in the Low Countries where as many as 10% of the adult female population lived as Beguines. Imagine this. You are a woman in medieval Bruges or Cologne or Strasbourg, and you don't want to marry, but you also don't want to enter a convent with its strict rules and perpetual vows. You hear about a beguinage, a community where women live together, support each other, work together, pray together, but take no permanent vows and retain control over their own property. You can leave whenever you want. You can return to secular life, get married if you choose. But while you are there, you live in a community entirely governed by women, where decisions are made by women, where the work you do benefits you and your sisters, where no man has authority over you. This wasn't a fantasy. This was reality for hundreds of thousands of women across medieval Europe for several centuries. According to Professor Simons, the beguinages were economically successful, often spectacularly so. The Beguines worked in textile production, nursing, teaching, and various crafts. They sold their products, accumulated wealth, owned property collectively and individually, and became significant economic actors in medieval cities. The Great Beguinage in Ghent, for example, housed over 1,000 women at its peak and functioned essentially as a woman-governed town within the city, with its own streets, squares, churches, and economic infrastructure. The Beguines were not living in poverty or dependence. They were living in what might be called medieval Europe's most successful experiment in women's economic cooperation and independence. But here is where the story becomes complicated and honestly quite disturbing. The very success of the Beguines made them threatening. According to Professor Simons, as Beguine communities grew in size and wealth, as women demonstrated that they could live successfully without male authority, religious and secular powers began to see them as dangerous. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council expressed concern about new religious movements, including Beguines, operating outside traditional church control. By 1311, at the Council of Vienne, the Church officially condemned Beguines, declaring their way of life heretical. The reasoning, according to church documents analysed by Professor Simons, was telling. The Church argued that women living without male spiritual authority, interpreting scripture for themselves, making their own religious choices, were inherently prone to error and heresy. The persecution that followed was brutal. According to research by Professor Diane Elliott from Northwestern University, whose work on medieval women and heresy examines the persecution of religious women, Beguines were accused of heresy, arrested, interrogated, and in some cases burned at the stake. In 1310, a Beguine named Marguerite Perrette was burned in Paris for writing a mystical text that church authorities deemed heretical. Her crime, fundamentally, was being a woman who wrote theology without male authorization, who claimed direct spiritual knowledge without male mediation, who lived independently and taught other women to do the same. Her execution was meant as a warning to all Beguines about the danger of women's independence and intellectual authority, yet even persecution couldn't fully destroy the Beguines. According to Professor Simons, while the movement declined significantly after 1311, Beguinages survived for centuries, some lasting into the 20th centuries. The women adapted, accepted more church oversight, lowered their profile, but maintained their core purpose of providing women with an alternative to marriage and the convent. The last Beguine, a woman named Marcella Patin, died in Belgium in 2013, ending a tradition that had lasted over 800 years. 8 centuries of women living independently, supporting each other, creating alternatives to patriarchal family structures, proving that women could thrive without male authority. Now let me tell you about a woman from a completely different time and place, because I want you to understand that women's desire for independence and autonomy wasn't limited to Europe or any single culture. Her name was Onodera Junko, and she lived in Edo period Japan in the late 18th century. According to research by Professor Anmoth Thal from the University of California, Irvine, whose work on Japanese women's history examines women's economic and social agency, Onodera Junko was a divorced woman who became one of the most successful merchants in her city, wealthy enough that men wanted to marry into her business, rather than the other way around. In Tokugawa, Japan, according to Professor Walthall, divorce was relatively accessible compared to many other pre-modern societies. Women could initiate divorce by fleeing to designated divorce temples and staying there for a set period, after which the divorce would be recognized. Onodera Junko divorced her husband for reasons that aren't entirely clear from historical records, but what we know is that after her divorce, she established herself as a sake brewer and merchant. Over decades of work, she built her business into one of the most successful in her region. She employed numerous workers, both male and female. She conducted business negotiations with male merchants, who had to treat her as an equal because her economic power demanded it. But here is what is so fascinating about Onodera Junko's story, and what Professor Walthall emphasizes in her analysis. Onodera Junko did eventually remarry, but on her own terms. She was courted by a younger man from a samurai family who wanted to marry into her wealth and business. In other words, he needed her more than she needed him. The marriage was structured to preserve her control over her business, essentially a business partnership rather than a traditional patriarchal marriage. And historical records suggest that she remained the primary decision maker in both the business and the household until her death. She had inverted the traditional power dynamic, using her years of independent success to ensure that even within marriage, she retained the autonomy she had built during her years alone. According to Professor Walthall, Onodera Junko's story wasn't unique. There were numerous divorced women and widows in Edo period Japan who became successful merchants, artisans, and business owners. These women occupied a complex social space, neither fully respectable nor completely marginalized. They were sometimes gossiped about, their unmarried status noted with a mixture of disapproval and grudging respect. But they were also economically essential, filling roles in commerce and production that needed to be filled, creating wealth and employing workers. Their independence was tolerated, even sometimes celebrated, precisely because it was economically productive and because these women proved themselves capable of succeeding in business. Let me tell you about another remarkable woman, this time from 19th century America, because the Victorian era that gave us the most vicious stereotypes about old maids also produced some of the most successfully independent women in history. Her name was Alice Austen, and she lived from 1866 to 1952 on Staten Island, New York. According to research by Professor Jennifer L. Border from the University of New Hampshire, whose work on Victorian women examines female friendship networks and independence, Alice Austen was a pioneering photographer who spent over 50 years documenting life in New York, particularly women's lives. and who lived for decades with another woman in what historians now recognize as a Boston marriage, a long-term romantic relationship between two women. Alice Austen never married a man, and according to Professor Border's analysis of her letters and photographs, she had no interest in doing so. She lived in her family home, clear comfort, and dedicated her life to photography, a field she essentially pioneered as one of the first women to use a camera seriously as a documentary and artistic tool. Her photographs, thousands of them preserved in archives, show a world of women's independence that Victorian ideology tried to pretend didn't exist. She photographed women playing tennis and golf, women working as street sweepers and quarantine workers, women in intimate domestic scenes with other women, women laughing and free and clearly enjoying their lives. In 1917, according to historical records analysed by Professor Border, Alice Austen's partner Gertrude Tate moved into clear comfort, and the two women lived together for the next 30 years, managing their household, travelling together, working on their creative and professional projects, functioning in every way as a married couple except for the legal recognition. Their relationship was known to their community, neither fully accepted nor openly condemned, occupying that ambiguous social space that many independent women's relationships occupied in the Victorian and early 20th century periods. They weren't hiding, but they also weren't publicly declaring a relationship that society had no framework to acknowledge. But here is where Alice Austen's story becomes heartbreaking, and then ultimately affirming. In the 1945, Alice and Gertrude lost clear comfort due to financial difficulties brought on by the Great Depression. Alice, now elderly and poor, ended up in a poorhouse, separated from Gertrude, having lost everything she had built over her lifetime. Her photographs, her life's work were nearly lost with her. But in 1951, a year before her death, a Life magazine article about her photographs brought her work to national attention. The public rallied, raised money for her care, and began the process of preserving her photographic legacy. Today, Alice Austen's work is recognised as historically invaluable, a unique documentary record of turn-of-the-century New York, and particularly of women's lives during that period. According to Professor Border, what makes Alice Austen's story so powerful is not just her individual achievement, but what her photographs reveal about a whole network of independent women who lived lives of meaning, friendship, work, and love outside of traditional marriage. Her photographs show us women who are not sad and lonely but active and engaged, women who had clearly chosen their lives deliberately, women who found fulfillment in work, friendship, art, and community rather than in marriage and motherhood. The Victorian stereotype of the tragic spinster is revealed as propaganda when we look at the actual lives these photographs document. Now let me tell you about women who chose religious life as a path to independence, because the history of convents and religious orders is far more complex than simple piety. It is also a history of women claiming education, intellectual authority, and freedom from male domestic control. Let me tell you about Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most accomplished people of the entire Middle Ages, and a woman who used religious life as a platform for achievements that would have been completely impossible for a married woman of her era. Hildegard was born in 1098 in what is now Germany, and according to research by Professor Barbara Newman from Northwestern University, whose extensive work on Hildegard examines her theology, music, and scientific writing, Hildegard was given to the church as a child, essentially dedicated to religious life by her family. She entered a women's religious community and eventually became the abbess, the leader of her own independent convent. This position gave her something that almost no other woman of her era possessed: authority, independence, and a platform for her intellectual and creative work. According to Professor Newman, Hildegard was a polymath who wrote theology, composed music, created detailed illustrations of her religious visions, wrote scientific and medical texts, corresponded with popes and emperors, went on preaching tours, and advised on major church and political matters. Her musical compositions are still performed today, hauntingly beautiful pieces that showcase her innovative musical thinking. Her theological writings are sophisticated and original, articulating a vision of the divine feminine that was radical for her time. Her scientific texts include detailed observations of the natural world, medical remedies, and theories about human health and sexuality. But here is what is crucial to understand about Hildegard and what Professor Newman emphasizes. None of this would have been possible if Hildegard had been married. A married woman of her class would have been expected to manage a household, bear and raise children, support her husband's political and economic activities. She would have had no time for composition or writing, no authority to preach or correspond with powerful men, no platform for theological or scientific work. The convent, paradoxically, gave Hildegard freedom. It removed her from the marriage market, placed her in a community of educated women, gave her access to books and learning, and ultimately gave her the authority to create, teach, and lead. According to research by Professor Jo Ann McNamara from Hunter College, whose comprehensive work on medieval religious women examines convent life across Europe, Hildegard's story was unusual in its spectacular success, but not unique in its basic pattern. Throughout the Middle Ages, convents were places where women could receive education, exercise authority, engage in intellectual work, and live in communities governed by women. Abbesses ruled over sometimes large and wealthy establishments, managing estates, conducting business, making legal and political decisions. They were, in many ways, the closest thing medieval society had to women leaders with real institutional power. The convent was not always chosen freely. Many women were pushed into religious life by families who didn't want to pay marriage dowries, or who had too many daughters to marry off advantageously. According to Professor McNamara, for some women, the convent was a disappointment, a constrained life they never wanted. But for others, particularly women with intellectual or spiritual ambitions, women who didn't want marriage and motherhood, or women who wanted to live in communities with other women, the convent offered opportunities that secular life completely denied. It was a space where women could be scholars, administrators, artists, writers, teachers and leaders in ways that married life would never allow. Let me tell you about the truly radical religious women, the ones who pushed even further against the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. Women like Sor Juana in Inés de la Cruz, a 17th century Mexican nun who became one of the greatest poets and intellectuals of the Spanish colonial period, and whose story reveals both the possibilities and the ultimate limitations of women's independence within religious institutions. Sor Juana was born Juana Inés de Hasbe y Ramírez in 1648 in New Spain, according to research by Professor Stephanie Merrim from Brown University, whose work on Sor Juana examines her literary achievement and intellectual life. As a young woman, brilliant and intellectually ambitious, Juana realized that marriage would end her opportunities for learning and writing. She chose instead to enter a convent, specifically selecting a relatively relaxed order that would allow her to pursue her studies. In her convent cell, she assembled a library of thousands of books, one of the largest private libraries in New Spain. She wrote poetry, plays, and theological and philosophical treatises. She corresponded with intellectuals across the Spanish Empire. She became famous. Her work circulated and celebrated. But according to Professor Merrim, Sor Juana's independence and intellectual authority eventually provoked a backlash. In 1690, she published a theological critique of a sermon by a prominent Portuguese Jesuit, arguing that he had misinterpreted scripture. This was an act of stunning audacity, a woman correcting a male theological authority on matters of scriptural interpretation. The response was swift and harsh. Church authorities, including her own bishop, condemned her presumption. They argued that women should not engage in theological debate, that Sor Juana should focus on prayer and humility rather than intellectual pursuits. In 1691, Sor Juana wrote her famous Reply to Sor Filotea, a defense of women's right to education and intellectual life that is now recognized as one of the earliest and most eloquent feminist texts in the Americas. In it, she argued that women have rational minds equal to men's, that denying women education is a form of tyranny, and that her pursuit of knowledge was both legitimate and valuable. According to Professor Merrim's analysis, the reply is remarkable, not just for its feminist arguments, but for its sophisticated rhetoric and its bold assertion of a woman's intellectual authority in the face of church power, telling her to be silent. But Sor Juana paid a terrible price for her boldness. In 1693, under intense pressure from church authorities, she signed a document renouncing her intellectual pursuits, sold her library and her scientific instruments, and devoted herself to extreme religious penance. According to historical records, she died in 1695, while nursing her sister nuns during an epidemic, essentially having given up the intellectual life that had given her identity and purpose. Her silencing was meant as a lesson, a demonstration of what happened to women who claimed too much intellectual authority, who refused to stay within the boundaries that patriarchal religious institutions set for them. Yet, even in defeat, Sor Juana's legacy lived on. Her works were published and read across the Spanish Empire. Her reply became a foundational text for feminist thinkers. Her poetry is still recognized as some of the finest in the Spanish language. She proved that a woman could achieve intellectual greatness, and while the institutions of her time ultimately silenced her, they could not erase what she had accomplished. Her life demonstrates both the possibilities that religious life could offer intellectually ambitious women and the ultimate limitations that patriarchal religious authority imposed when women's independence threatened male intellectual monopoly. Now, let me tell you about a completely different form of women's independence, one rooted not in religion or aristocratic wealth, but in the working class women who created lives of autonomy through sheer determination and economic necessity. Let me tell you about Mary Patton, an American sea captain who lived in the 19th century and whose story reveals how crisis and capability could sometimes force societies to acknowledge women's competence in realms usually reserved for men. Mary Patton was born in 1837, and according to research by Professor Joan Druitt, whose work on women at sea examines female sailors and their experiences, Mary learned navigation and sailing from her husband, a sea captain. This was unusual but not unheard of. Many captains' wives accompanied their husbands on long voyages and learned practical seamanship, but Mary's skills were put to an extraordinary test in 1856 when she was 19 years old and pregnant, sailing around Cape Horn on the clipper ship Neptune's Car. According to historical records analysed by Professor Druitt during the voyage, Mary's husband fell ill, possibly with brain fever, and became unable to command the ship. The first mate, who should have taken command, proved incompetent and possibly mutinous. Mary Patton, 19 years old, pregnant, and technically just a passenger with no official role, took command of the ship. For 56 days, she navigated around Cape Horn, one of the most dangerous passages in the world, through storms and rough seas, commanding a crew of male sailors who initially resisted taking orders from a teenage woman. She brought the ship safely to San Francisco, saving the vessel, the cargo, and the lives of everyone aboard. The insurance company that owned the cargo was so impressed that they awarded Mary an extremely rare honor, a payment of $1,000 in recognition of her skill and courage, a substantial sum at the time. Newspapers celebrated her achievement. For a brief moment, Mary Patton was famous, held up as an example of female capability and courage. But according to Professor Druitt, the story's ending is less triumphant. Mary's husband died from his illness shortly after they reached California. Mary gave birth to their son, who had severe disabilities, likely due to the stress of the voyage. She spent the rest of her relatively short life caring for her disabled son, living quietly, her moment of spectacular competence and authority reduced to a single adventure, before she returned to the conventional female role of caretaker. She died in 1861, at just 24 years old. What makes Mary Patton's story so revealing is not just her individual achievement, but how society responded to it. According to Professor Druitt, Mary was celebrated precisely because her command of the ship was temporary, brought on by emergency, and followed by a return to traditional female roles. She didn't threaten the social order because she didn't continue to captain ships, didn't demand that women be admitted to maritime academies, didn't use her achievement to claim broader rights for women. She was the exception that proved the rule, a woman who showed extraordinary capability in a male sphere, but who could be safely celebrated because she didn't use that capability to challenge male dominance of seafaring. Yet for those 56 days, Mary Patton lived a life of complete authority and autonomy. She made decisions that affected the lives and safety of dozens of men. She commanded and was obeyed. She demonstrated skills that many male captains never matched. For that brief time, she lived without any male authority over her, purely on the basis of her competence and courage. That experience, however temporary, reveals that women's supposed incapability in traditionally male spheres was always a fiction, a social construction rather than a natural fact. Let me tell you about another working-class woman who created independence through economic necessity, but whose story spans decades rather than days. Her name was Rebecca Protten, and she lived in the 18th century as a freed black woman in the Caribbean who became a missionary and religious teacher. According to research by Professor John Sensbach from the University of Florida, whose work on Rebecca Protten examines her remarkable life. Rebecca was born into slavery on the island of Antigua around 1718, was freed as a young woman, and joined the Moravian Church, a Protestant denomination that, unusually for the time, welcomed black members and even black religious leaders. Rebecca became a missionary teaching Christianity to enslaved and free black people in the Caribbean. She lived for several years as an independent woman, supporting herself through teaching and the patronage of the church, traveling between islands to conduct her missionary work. According to historical records analyzed by Professor Sensbach, Rebecca eventually married a Moravian missionary named Friedrich Mieder, but he died within a few years, leaving her a widow. Rather than remarrying immediately or returning to dependence on family, Rebecca continued her missionary work. Now, as a widow, with even more freedom of movement and authority, she eventually remarried to another Moravian missionary named Matthias Frundlich. But according to Professor Sensbach, the historical records make clear that Rebecca was a full partner in the missionary work. Not merely a helper to her husband, she preached, she taught, she led religious meetings, and she was recognized by the Moravian Church as having spiritual authority in her own right. When her second husband died, she continued the missionary work alone, an elderly black woman teaching and preaching in a world that usually denied such authority to women, to black people, and especially to black women. What makes Rebecca Protten's story so remarkable, according to Professor Sensbach, is how she used the liminal spaces created by widowhood and religious calling to carve out a life of authority and purpose that would have been completely impossible for her as either an enslaved woman or even as a free black woman in conventional society. The Moravian Church, with its relatively egalitarian theology, provided a framework within which Rebecca's intelligence and spiritual gifts could be acknowledged. Widowhood provided freedom from the constraints of being a wife while still maintaining social respectability. The combination allowed Rebecca to live a life of teaching, preaching, and religious leadership that lasted decades. But according to Professor Sensbach, we should not romanticize Rebecca's independence. She lived in poverty for much of her life. The Moravian Church valued her spiritual contributions but provided minimal financial support. She faced racism from white Moravians who acknowledged her spiritual gifts but still saw her as racially inferior. She endured the trauma of living in a slave society, even after gaining her own freedom, teaching enslaved people who would remain in bondage while she could not. Her independence was hard-won and costly, achieved through immense determination and sacrifice. Now let me tell you about a phenomenon that might surprise you, a time and place where women living without men was not just tolerated, but actually common and socially accepted. I am talking about the southwestern United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in homesteading regions where the gender ratio was heavily skewed and where frontier conditions created opportunities for women's economic independence. According to research by Professor D. Garceau from Rhodes College, whose work on Western women examines female homesteaders, thousands of unmarried women claimed homestead land under the various Homestead Acts, living alone or with other women and creating successful ranches and farms. Let me tell you about Elinor Prout Stewart, whose letters about her experiences as a homesteader were published as Letters of a Woman Homesteader in 1914 and provide a first-hand account of frontier women's independence. Elinor was a widow with a young daughter when she decided to claim homestead land in Wyoming in 1909. According to her letters, analysed by Professor Garceau, Elinor deliberately chose homesteading as a path to independence. She wrote that she was tired of working as a domestic servant, tired of being dependent on employers, and wanted land and independence of her own. Elinor's letters describe the hard work of homesteading with remarkable cheerfulness. She built her own cabin, broke land for planting, raised cattle and chickens, hunted game for food, and did all the heavy labour that homesteading required. She wrote about the beauty of the Wyoming landscape, the satisfaction of owning her own land, the freedom of making her own decisions. According to Professor Garceau, Elinor eventually married her neighbour, but she maintained her independence throughout, keeping ownership of her own homestead and continuing to work her land alongside managing her household and raising children. But here is what is so important about Elinor's story, and the stories of thousands of other women homesteaders. According to Professor Garceau, these women were able to live independently and claim land in their own names precisely because the frontier created conditions where women's labour was valuable and where traditional gender restrictions were loosened out of necessity. There weren't enough men to do all the work, so women's capability in traditionally male tasks like ploughing, building and ranch work was acknowledged and even valued. Women could own property, run businesses, and make legal decisions with a freedom that their counterparts in more settled eastern states did not have. Yet this freedom was temporary and contingent, according to Professor Garceau. As western states became more settled, as gender ratios evened out, as social institutions became more established, the restrictions on women's behaviour tightened. The frontier period of relative gender flexibility gave way to more conventional Victorian gender roles. Women who had run ranches and businesses found themselves pushed back into more domestic roles as their communities civilized. The window of opportunity for women's independence on the frontier was real but brief, open during the chaotic settlement period, but closing as society stabilized. Let me tell you about women who chose to live together in what historians call Boston marriages, long-term romantic and domestic partnerships between women that allowed both partners to maintain independence from men while enjoying companionship, intimacy, and mutual support. These relationships were common enough in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that they were recognized social phenomena, though the nature of the relationships was often deliberately ambiguous, neither openly acknowledged as romantic nor entirely hidden. Let me tell you about Catherine Lee Bates and Catherine Coman, two professors at Wellesley College, who lived together for over 25 years until Coman's death in 1915. According to research by Professor Judith Schwartz, whose work on Boston marriages examines these relationships, Bates and Coman met as young professors at Wellesley in the 1880s and eventually established a household together, sharing their lives, supporting each other's careers, and functioning as a couple in every way except legal recognition. Catherine Lee Bates, according to historical records, was a prominent English professor and poet, best known for writing the lyrics to America the Beautiful. Catherine Coman was an influential economist and social reformer who helped establish social work as an academic discipline. According to Professor Schwartz, both women had demanding professional lives, publishing books and articles, teaching, and contributing to their academic fields in ways that would have been far more difficult if they had been married to men and expected to prioritize their husbands' careers and manage households. According to conventional standards, the relationship between Bates and Coman was known to their community at Wellesley, according to Professor Schwartz. They were referred to as a couple, lived together openly, and were accepted as such within the all-female environment of Wellesley College. But the nature of their relationship remained carefully unspecified. In letters and diaries, they expressed deep love for each other, used passionate language that to modern readers clearly indicates romantic love, but always with plausible deniability, always in language that could be interpreted as intense friendship, rather than explicitly romantic partnership. When Catherine Coman died in 1915 after a long illness, Catherine Lee Bates was devastated. She wrote poems about her grief that clearly expressed the depth of her loss, referring to Coman as her closest comrade, and describing a loneliness that would last the rest of her life. According to Professor Schwartz, Bates never formed another significant relationship after Coman's death, living alone but surrounded by friends and colleagues for another 14 years until her own death in 1929. What makes stories like Bates and Coman so significant is not just that they represent romantic relationships between women, though that is certainly important. According to Professor Schwartz, these Boston marriages created a space where educated women could live independent, intellectually and professionally fulfilling lives while enjoying intimate companionship and emotional support. These women didn't have to choose between marriage and independence. They found a third path, one that combined domestic partnership with professional autonomy, emotional intimacy with intellectual freedom. Yet we should not idealize these relationships as completely free from the constraints of their time. According to Professor Schwartz, the women in Boston marriages had to be careful, had to maintain enough ambiguity about the nature of their relationships to avoid scandal, had to accept that their partnerships would never be legally recognized or socially validated in the way heterosexual marriages were. They lived in a kind of shadow space, acknowledged but not named, accepted but not embraced. The freedom they achieved was real but circumscribed, always contingent on maintaining plausible deniability, and on not challenging social norms too explicitly. Now, let me tell you about women who were forced into independence, not by choice, but by circumstances, and whose stories reveal how women created lives of meaning and survival even when independence was imposed upon them, rather than freely chosen. I am talking about widows, women who lost husbands to death, and found themselves alone with children to support and no male protection, in societies that viewed women's independence with suspicion. Let me tell you about Marjorie Kempe, a real person whose story we know from historical records, and who represents thousands of working-class widows in medieval England, trying to survive through entrepreneurship and determination. Wait, I've already told you about Marjorie Kempe, the mystic. Let me tell you instead about a different woman, Agnes Fitcherbert, a widow who lived in 14th century England and whose story emerges from legal records analysed by Professor Judith Bennett. Agnes was the widow of a successful brewer, and when her husband died, she inherited his brewing business. According to Professor Bennett, this was common in medieval England. Widows often took over their husbands' businesses, becoming brewers, bakers, merchants, and craftswomen. Agnes ran the brewery successfully for over 20 years, employing workers selling ale and becoming a significant economic actor in her town. Historical records show her paying taxes, appearing in court cases related to her business, and generally operating as an independent economic agent. But according to Professor Bennett, Agnes's independence was always precarious. As a widow running a business, she faced suspicions that she wasn't truly respectable, that her independence made her sexually available or morally questionable. She was fined multiple times for selling ale without proper licensing, and Professor Bennett suggests that authorities may have targeted independent women like Agnes with such fines more frequently than they targeted male brewers. using regulatory enforcement as a way to discipline women who operated too independently. When Agnes eventually remarried, the business came under her new husband's control, and she essentially disappeared from historical records, her years of independent business operation erased by marriage. What Agnes's story reveals, according to Professor Bennett, is the temporary nature of many women's independence. Widowhood created a space where women could and did operate businesses, own property, and exercise economic agency. But that space was always conditional, always subject to social pressure to remarry and return to male authority, always vulnerable to legal and economic discrimination that made women's independent business operation more difficult and less profitable than men's. Let me tell you about a woman who chose independence deliberately, dramatically, and at great personal cost, because I want you to understand that women's independence wasn't always celebrated or even tolerated. Her name was Flora Tristan, and she lived in 19th century France and Peru, a time and place where women had almost no legal rights, and where an independent woman was viewed as dangerous and immoral. Flora was born in Paris in 1803, the daughter of a Peruvian aristocrat and a French woman. According to research by Professor Sandra Dijkstra, whose work on Flora Tristan examines her life and writings, Flora made the catastrophic mistake of marrying young, at 17, to a man named Andras Sav. The marriage was abusive from the beginning. Chazol was violent, controlling, and unfaithful. But in early 19th century France, according to Professor Dijkstra, women could not legally divorce. Marriage was permanent. A woman's property belonged to her husband. Her children belonged to her husband, and she had no legal recourse against abuse. Flora did something radical. She fled. She left her husband, taking her young daughter with her, and began living independently, supporting herself by working as a lady's companion and artist's model. This was not just unconventional, it was illegal. She was a fugitive wife, and her husband had legal grounds to force her to return. According to historical records analysed by Professor Dijkstra, Chazal pursued Flora for years, demanding that she return to him, threatening her, and ultimately becoming so violent that in 1838 he shot her on a Paris street, seriously wounding her. The assassination attempt became a scandal. Chazal was tried and imprisoned, but according to Professor Dijkstra, the trial revealed the impossible position that Flora and women like her occupied. The court acknowledged that Chazal had attempted murder, but the prosecutor's arguments focused on Flora's immorality in leaving her husband, suggesting that her behaviour had driven him to violence. The implication was that women who claimed independence were responsible for the male violence directed against them. Flora survived and used her experience to become one of France's earliest socialist feminists. She wrote books arguing for women's rights, workers' rights, and social reform. Her most famous work, The Workers' Union, published in 1843, argued that workers could only achieve liberation if women were also liberated, that women's oppression and workers' oppression were interconnected and had to be fought together. According to Professor Dijkstra, Flora travelled throughout France giving speeches to workers, advocating for the creation of workers' unions and for women's education and legal rights. She was one of the first thinkers to articulate what we would now call intersectional feminism, the idea that different forms of oppression are connected and must be addressed together. But Flora paid a terrible price for her independence and activism. She lived in poverty, always moving to avoid creditors and hostile authorities. She was denounced by conservative Catholics as immoral and by male socialists as too radical. She was exhausted by constant work and travel. In 1844, at age 41, she died of typhoid fever while on a speaking tour, having worn herself out in pursuit of the social transformation she believed was possible. According to Professor Dijkstra, Flora's daughter Aline later became the grandmother of the painter Paul Gauguin, who inherited some of his grandmother's radical spirit. Flora Tristan's story reveals the cost of women's independence when society was actively hostile to it. Flora didn't have the protection of wealth, or aristocratic status or religious calling. She was a working-class woman who claimed independence purely through her own courage and determination. She lived alone, worked for herself, spoke her mind, and advocated for radical social change. And society punished her for it, through violence, through poverty, through constant harassment and condemnation. Yet she persisted, creating a body of work that influenced socialist and feminist thinking for generations. Now let me tell you about women's independence in a culture very different from the European and American contexts we've been exploring. Let me tell you about the Mozuo people of southwestern China, a society that has maintained a matrilineal and matriarchal social structure into the present day, where women traditionally don't marry at all in the conventional sense, and where women living independently is not just accepted, but the cultural norm, according to research by Professor Chuan Kang-shi from the University of Illinois, whose anthropological work examines Mozuo society. The Mozuo practice what they call walking marriage or visiting relationships. In this system, women remain in their mothers' households their entire lives. Men visit their lovers at night but return to their own mothers' households in the morning. Children are raised by their mothers and maternal uncles. Women own property collectively with their mothers and sisters. There is no concept of a woman belonging to a man through marriage. In Mozuo society, according to Professor Shea, women are the primary economic decision makers. They manage household resources, make decisions about agriculture and business, and pass property from mother to daughter. Men contribute labor and may have visiting relationships with women, but they don't have authority over women or children. The household is governed by the eldest woman, the matriarch, and her authority is recognized by the entire extended family. What is remarkable about Mozuo society, according to Professor Shai, is that it demonstrates that the nuclear family structure, with male authority and female subordination, is not universal or natural but culturally specific. The Mozuo have organized their society around maternal lineage and female authority for centuries, and their society functions successfully by any measure of social cohesion, economic productivity, and individual well-being. Women in Mozuo society don't experience the isolation, stigma, or economic vulnerability that unmarried women face in patriarchal societies, precisely because their society is not organized around male authority and female dependence. But according to Professor Shea, even Mozuo society is changing as it encounters dominant Chinese culture and global capitalism. Younger Mozuo people are increasingly adopting conventional marriage, partly due to economic pressure and partly due to the influence of Chinese cultural norms that view the traditional Mozuo system as backward or immoral. The Chinese government has pressured the Mozuo to adopt legal marriage, and tourism has brought in outside cultural influences that challenge traditional Mozuo values. The unique space that Mozuo society created for women's independence and authority is being eroded by the same forces that have constrained women's independence in other societies. Let me tell you about a modern woman whose choice to live alone has become a cultural phenomenon and a subject of sociological study. Her name is Emma Watson, the actress famous for playing Hermione in Harry Potter films, who in a 2019 interview coined the term self-partnered to describe her relationship status, and whose comments sparked a global conversation about women's independence and the language we use to describe it. According to the interview, Watson, then 29, said she felt anxious about turning 30 because society made her feel that she should be married or at least in a serious relationship by that age. But she realized that she was actually very happy with her life, and that the anxiety came from external social pressure rather than internal dissatisfaction. She described herself as self-partnered, a term that reframes being single not as a deficit or a waiting period, but as a complete relationship status in itself, where one is in partnership with oneself. The response to Watson's comments was revealing. According to analysis by Professor Bella DiPolo from the University of California, Santa Barbara, whose research examines single life and discrimination against single people. Watson's term self-partnered was both celebrated and ridiculed. Some people, particularly young women, embraced it as validating their own choices to prioritize independence, career, and self-development over romantic relationships. Others mocked it as self-indulgent or delusional, arguing that being single is being single and doesn't need to be dressed up with fancy terms. But according to Professor DiPolo, what Watson's comments and the response to them reveal is that contemporary society still struggles to accept women's independence as a legitimate choice rather than a temporary state or a failure. The language we use matters. We say someone is still single, implying that single is a condition to move past. We ask when someone is going to settle down, implying that independence is unsettled, unstable, incomplete. We express pity for women who are alone, even when they explicitly state they are happy. The assumption remains that women are meant to be in relationships with men, and that a woman who isn't is either tragic or selfish. According to research by Professor Kay Trimberger from Sonoma State University, whose work examines single women in contemporary society, there has been a dramatic increase in the number of women choosing to remain single or to prioritize independence over marriage. In the United States, the median age of first marriage for women has risen from 21 in 1970 to 28 in 2020, and an increasing number of women are never marrying at all. Some of this is economic, reflecting the difficulty of affording marriage and family in an era of wage stagnation and high costs. But some of it, according to Professor Trimberger, is choice, reflecting women's increasing ability to support themselves economically and their recognition that marriage is not necessary for a fulfilling life. Yet, according to Professor Trimberger, single women, particularly those who remain single into their 30s and 40s, still face significant social stigma and economic discrimination. They are often excluded from social events designed for couples. They face assumptions that they are lonely, desperate, or flawed in some way. They may be passed over for promotions because employers assume they lack stability. They pay more in taxes than married couples and receive fewer benefits. They are asked invasive questions about their personal lives that married people are not asked. The independence that women like Emma Watson claim is real, but it exists within a society that still fundamentally questions whether women have the right to choose independence. Now let me tell you about women who had no choice about their independence. Women who lived alone not because they wanted to, but because circumstances forced them into isolation. I am talking about women who were widowed with children to support, women who were abandoned by husbands, women who were ostracized for being different or for violating social norms. Let me tell you about Mary Catherine Goddard, an 18th century American printer who became one of the most important publishers of the Revolutionary period, but whose independence was born from necessity rather than choice. Mary Catherine Goddard was born in 1738, and according to research by Professor Susan Henry from California State University, Northridge, Mary learned the printing trade from her brother, who ran a newspaper. When her brother's business failed and he left town, Mary took over, becoming the printer and publisher of the Maryland Journal. According to Professor Henry, Mary ran the newspaper successfully for over a decade, during which time she became the official printer for the state of Maryland, and in 1777 printed the first official copies of the Declaration of Independence that included the signers' names. Mary's achievement was remarkable. She was one of the very few women printers in colonial America, operating in a trade that was physically demanding and required technical skill, business acumen, and political sophistication. According to Professor Henry, Mary's newspaper was influential during the Revolutionary period, and her printing of the Declaration made her an important figure in Revolutionary history. Yet she operated essentially alone, without a husband to provide economic support or social respectability, in a society that viewed women's independence with suspicion. In 1784, Mary's brother returned and demanded that she give him back the newspaper. A legal battle ensued, and ultimately Mary was forced to relinquish the newspaper she had built and sustained for over a decade. According to Professor Henry, the legal system of the time gave women few rights in property disputes with male relatives. Mary spent the rest of her life running a small print shop and bookstore, never again achieving the success and influence she had as a newspaper publisher. She died in 1816, largely forgotten, her contributions to American independence unacknowledged until recent historians recovered her story. What Mary Goddard's story reveals is that even when women proved themselves capable of succeeding in male-dominated fields, even when they made significant contributions to important historical moments, their independence was always vulnerable to male relatives and to legal systems that privileged men's rights over women's achievements. Mary didn't choose independence as a path to freedom and self-actualization. She was forced into it by her brother's abandonment, and she ultimately lost what she had built to that same brother when he decided to reclaim it. Let me tell you about another woman whose independence was forced by circumstance, and whose story reveals the intersection of race, gender, and independence. Her name was Edmonia Lewis, and she lived in 19th century America as a biracial woman, part African American and part Native American, who became one of the most successful sculptors of her era, despite facing discrimination that made her independence both necessary and extremely difficult. Edmonia Lewis was born around 1844, and according to research by Professor Kirsten Pye Buick from the University of New Mexico, whose work on African American art examines Lewis's career, Edmonia's mixed race heritage and orphan status meant that she had to create her own path from an early age. She attended Oberlin College, one of the few institutions that accepted black students, but was forced to leave after being falsely accused of poisoning 2 white students in a racist attack. She survived a brutal beating by vigilantes, but lost her opportunity for formal education. Edmonia moved to Boston and then to Rome, where she established herself as a sculptor, creating works that celebrated Black and Native American subjects, and that challenged the racist assumptions of her era. According to Professor Buick, Edmonia lived in Rome for most of her adult life, choosing to remain unmarried and independent, supporting herself through her art. She created works like The Death of Cleopatra, a massive sculpture that depicted the Egyptian queen as a powerful black woman challenging racist art historical traditions that whitewashed ancient Africans. But Edmonia's independence came at significant cost. According to Professor Buick, she faced constant racism from white patrons and fellow artists. Her work was dismissed as primitive or exotic rather than being judged on its artistic merit. She struggled financially, sometimes barely surviving, and as a black woman living alone in a foreign country, she was vulnerable to exploitation and had no family support system to fall back on. Her independence was both a necessity, given that marriage to a white man would have been extremely difficult, and marriage to a black man might have constrained her artistic career, and a burden, given how isolated and vulnerable it left her. Edmonia Lewis died in London in 1907, and for decades her work was largely forgotten. According to Professor Buick, it wasn't until the late 20th century that art historians began to recover her contributions and to recognize her as one of the pioneering African American sculptors. Her life demonstrates how women of color faced multiple layers of constraint, how independence for them meant not just freedom from male authority, but also navigation of racism and economic marginalization, and how even when they achieved remarkable success, their contributions were erased from historical memory far more completely than white women's achievements were. Now, let me tell you something that might surprise you about contemporary society. Despite all the progress women have made, despite legal equality in most Western countries, despite women's ability to own property, earn income, and make their own decisions, single women still face significant disadvantages and stigma. According to research by Professor Bella De Paulo, single women are discriminated against in employment, housing, healthcare, and social life in ways that are so normalized we barely notice them. Professor De Paulo's research documents what she calls singleism, systematic discrimination against single people. Single women pay more in taxes than married women because the tax code privileges marriage. They have more difficulty renting apartments because landlords prefer married couples, viewing them as more stable. They are excluded from family-oriented social events and neighborhoods. They face assumptions from doctors that their health problems must be related to their lack of a partner. They are asked invasive questions about their personal lives that married women are not asked. The message is clear. Society still views women's independence with suspicion and still structures social and economic life around the assumption that women should be married. According to research by Professor Eric Klinenberg from New York University, whose work on living alone examines the dramatic rise in solo living worldwide, in 1960, about 9% of American households were single-person households. By 2020, that number had risen to 28%. And in some cities like Manhattan, over 50% of households are single-person. This is not just an American phenomenon. In many developed countries, solo living has become increasingly common, and women are a significant part of this trend, with many women choosing to live alone rather than marry or cohabitate. Yet, according to Professor Klinenberg, this increasing independence for women exists alongside persistent cultural narratives that frame women's solo living as problematic. The media produces endless content about the loneliness epidemic, much of it focused on single women and suggesting that living alone is inherently unhealthy or sad. Marriage is still framed as a universal goal, with people who choose not to marry viewed as either unfortunate or immature. The freedom that women have gained to live independently has not yet translated into full cultural acceptance of women's independent living as a legitimate permanent life choice, rather than a temporary state or a problem to be solved. What all these stories, from medieval Europe to contemporary America, from ancient Rome to modern China, reveal is a consistent pattern. Women throughout history have sought independence, have created it when possible, have lived it when necessary, and have paid various costs for it depending on the support or hostility of the societies they lived in. The specific forms that independence took varied enormously, from religious communities to frontier homesteads, from wealthy widows to working class entrepreneurs, from romantic partnerships between women to deliberate solo living. But the underlying desire for autonomy, for control over one's own life, for the ability to make choices based on one's own needs and values, rather than on male authority or social pressure, remains constant. And what becomes clear when you look at all these stories together is that women's ability to live independently has never been primarily about women's capability or desire. It has always been about social, legal, and economic structures that either support or constrain women's independence. The Mozo demonstrate that entire societies can be organized around women's independence and female authority. The Beguines demonstrate that women can create economic and social institutions that support independent women's flourishing. The frontier homesteaders demonstrate that when women's labor is valued and when legal structures permit it, women can succeed in any field. The problem has never been women. The problem has always been societies that organize themselves around male authority and female subordination, and that view women's independence as threatening to that organization. As we come to the end of tonight's journey through centuries of women's independent lives, I want you to think about the freedom you have right now. If you are a woman lying in your own apartment, in a space you chose and pay for yourself, making your own decisions about how to spend your time and resources, you are living a life that would have been impossible, illegal, or dangerous for most of human history. If you are a man who knows and respects independent women in your life, who doesn't question their choices or assume they need rescue or completion, you are part of breaking down social structures that have constrained women for millennia. The women we've met tonight, from Marjorie Kempe to Emma Watson, from Hortensia to Edmonia Lewis, from the Beguines to the Mozuo, all shared a common understanding. Independence is not about rejecting connection or community or love. It is about having the choice The ability to decide for yourself what kind of life you want to live, what relationships you want to form, what work you want to do, what values you want to pursue. These women understood that independence is the foundation for all other freedoms, that without autonomy, all other choices are constrained or illusory. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to remember these women. Remember Marjorie Kempe walking alone across medieval Europe to Jerusalem, claiming space for her own spiritual life. Remember Hortensia standing in the Roman Forum, demanding that women not be taxed without representation. Remember the thousands of beguines creating communities where women govern themselves and thrived economically. Remember Mary Patton commanding a ship through Cape Horn at 19. Remember Rebecca Prosson teaching and preaching across the Caribbean. Remember Flora Tristan advocating for workers and women's rights despite violence and poverty. Remember Edmonia Lewis creating art that challenged racism and celebrated Black and Native American subjects. These women lived in times far more hostile to women's independence than ours. They faced legal restrictions, economic discrimination, social stigma, and sometimes physical violence for choosing to live without male authority. Yet they persisted. They found ways to create meaning, purpose, achievement, and often joy in their independent lives. They proved that women don't need men to complete them, to give their lives purpose, to make them fully human. They demonstrated that women's autonomy is not a modern invention, but a persistent human drive that has existed throughout history, constrained by societies, but never fully suppressed. And I want you to remember that the freedom you enjoy today was built by these women and countless others like them. Every time a woman claimed her right to own property, to earn her own income, to make her own decisions, to live her own life, she was expanding the boundaries of what was possible for all women who came after. Every time a woman demonstrated competence in a field reserved for men, survived independently despite social hostility, created communities of mutual support with other women, or simply lived her life on her own terms, despite the cost, she was building the foundation for the freedom you have now. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lives of independent women across history. I hope these stories have given you a new appreciation for the women who fought for autonomy, a new understanding of the social structures that constrain freedom, and perhaps some inspiration to examine your own life and choices. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about what independence means to you. Think about the choices you have that previous generations didn't have. Think about the choices you make with that freedom, and think about what kind of world you want to create. One that supports or constrains independence, one that celebrates or stigmatizes autonomy, one that trusts people to make their own choices, or that insists there is only one right way to live. But before we finish tonight's journey, let me tell you about more women whose stories deserve to be remembered. Because the more we explore, the more we discover that women's independence was never rare or aberrant, but consistently present throughout history, constantly emerging despite society's attempts to suppress it. Let me tell you about women who created independence through intellectual achievement, through economic necessity, through spiritual calling, and through sheer determination to live authentic lives regardless of the cost. Let me tell you about Anna Leonowens, whose story you might know from The King and I, but whose real life was far more complex and interesting than the musical suggests. Anna was born in India in 1831, and according to research by Professor Susan Morgan from Miami University of Ohio, whose work on Anna Leonowens examines her actual biography versus the fictionalized versions, Anna spent her life reinventing herself, creating and recreating her identity in ways that gave her independence and authority in Victorian society that usually denied such things to women. Anna worked as a governess in Siam, now Thailand, where she taught English to the children of King Mongkut. But according to Professor Morgan, what is most interesting about Anna is not her time in Siam, but what she did afterward. She moved to Canada and then New York, where she established herself as a writer and lecturer, giving talks about her experiences in Siam and writing memoirs that made her famous. She created a persona of herself as a member of British gentry, when in fact she was born to a working-class family. She presented herself as a widow when her husband had actually been a relatively unsuccessful minor clerk. She essentially wrote her own story, creating the narrative of her life that gave her the social standing and authority that her actual background would have denied her. According to Professor Morgan, we shouldn't judge Anna harshly for these fabrications. In Victorian society, a woman's ability to support herself, to be taken seriously as a writer and lecturer, to command respect and attention, depended enormously on her perceived social status. Anna understood that truth was a luxury she couldn't afford if she wanted independence. So she created a truth that served her purposes, and she lived that created identity so thoroughly that it became her reality. She supported herself through her writing and lecturing for decades, never remarrying, maintaining her independence until her death in 1915 at age 83. What Anna Leonowens' story reveals is the creativity and adaptability that women had to employ to create and maintain independence. She couldn't simply claim authority based on her abilities and experiences. She had to construct a persona that Victorian society would accept as having the right to that authority. Her fabrications were not dishonesty but survival strategy, the tools she used to carve out space for her independence in a society that would have denied it to a working-class woman with her actual background. Now let me tell you about women who used illness and invalidism as a path to independence, because this might seem contradictory, but according to research by Professor Diane Price, Herndl from Colorado State University, whose work on invalid women in 19th century literature examines the cultural meaning of women's illness. Many Victorian women found that claiming illness gave them freedom from social obligations, from the physical demands of constant childbearing, and from the expectation that they subordinate their own needs and desires to their families. Let me tell you about Alice James, the sister of the famous writer Henry James and the philosopher William James. Alice was born in 1848 into a wealthy intellectual family, and according to research by Professor Jean Strauss, whose biography of Alice James examines her life and writings, Alice was as intelligent and perceptive as her famous brothers. But as a woman, she had no outlet for her intellectual gifts. She couldn't attend university, couldn't pursue a profession, couldn't engage in public intellectual life. The only role available to her was that of daughter and eventually wife. Alice developed what Victorian doctors called hysteria and what modern doctors might recognise as a combination of depression, anxiety and psychosomatic illness. She spent much of her adult life as an invalid, confined to bed or couch, unable to participate in normal social activities. But according to Professor Strauss, Alice's invalidism gave her something that health would have denied her: the right to refuse social obligations, to spend her time reading and thinking rather than making social calls and managing a household, to live with a female companion, Catherine Loring, in what was essentially a Boston marriage, and to focus on her own intellectual and emotional life rather than serving others. Alice kept a diary during her final years, and according to Professor Strauss, the diary reveals a brilliant, acerbic, deeply intelligent woman who used her illness as a shield against the demands that Victorian society made on women. She wrote perceptive observations about politics, society, and human nature. She analysed her own psychology with remarkable insight. She created, within the confines of her sick room, a space for intellectual life that the healthy world of Victorian womanhood would never have permitted her. Alice James died of breast cancer in 1892 at age 43, and her diary was published posthumously. According to Professor Strauss, the diary reveals that Alice's invalidism, while certainly involving real suffering, was also a form of resistance, a way of opting out of a society that had no place for an intellectually ambitious woman who didn't want to marry or subordinate herself to social expectations. Her illness gave her permission to live with Catherine Loring, to refuse to marry, to spend her days reading and writing rather than making social calls and managing a household. It was independence purchased through suffering, but it was independence nonetheless. Now let me tell you about women who found independence through artistic communities, because the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of bohemian artistic circles where conventional social rules were relaxed and where women could live more freely. Let me tell you about Natalie Clifford Barney, an American writer and salon hostess who lived in Paris from 1900 until her death in 1972, and who created one of the most famous literary salons in Paris, a space where women writers, artists, and intellectuals gathered, and where women's independence and same-sex relationships were openly celebrated. Natalie Barney was born in 1876 to a wealthy American family, and according to research by Professor Carla Jay from Pace University, whose work on lesbian modernist writers examines Barney's life and literary circle, Natalie decided early that she would never marry and that she would live openly as a lesbian, something almost unheard of in her era. She moved to Paris, where the bohemian artistic community was more tolerant than American society, and she established a weekly salon at her home on the left bank that became legendary in literary circles. According to Professor Jay, Barney's salon brought together the most important women writers and artists of the early 20th century, including Gertrude Stein, Colette, Juna Barnes, Radcliffe Hall, and dozens of others. It was a space where women could be themselves, where lesbian relationships were acknowledged and accepted, where women's artistic and intellectual work was taken seriously. Barney herself wrote poetry, plays, and memoirs, all of which celebrated women's independence and women's love for other women. She lived openly with various women partners throughout her long life, most notably with the painter Romaine Brooks, with whom she had a 50-year relationship. What makes Natalie Barney's story so significant, according to Professor Jay, is that she created community for independent women, a space where they could support each other, celebrate each other's work, and live without pretense or apology. Her salon was not just a social gathering, but a political statement, an assertion that women could live independently, love other women, create art and literature, and build lives of meaning and purpose outside of conventional marriage and motherhood. And importantly, Barney had the wealth to create and maintain this space, demonstrating how economic privilege could sometimes shield women from the worst consequences of social nonconformity. But let me also tell you about women without Barney's wealth, women who created independence through sheer determination, and often at great costs. Let me tell you about Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American writer and anthropologist who lived from 1891 to 1960, and whose life demonstrates the particular challenges that black women faced in claiming independence in a society that discriminated against them based on both race and gender. Zora Neale Hurston grew up in poverty in Florida, and according to research by Professor Valerie Boyd, whose biography of Hurston examines her life and work, Zora was determined from a young age to get education and to become a writer, ambitions that were almost impossibly difficult for a poor black girl in the early 20th century South. She worked as a maid and waitress to pay for school, eventually making her way to Barnard College in New York, where she was the only black student, and then to Columbia University, where she studied anthropology with Franz Boas. Zora became a prominent figure in the Harlem Renaissance, writing novels, short stories, and anthropological works that celebrated black culture, and particularly black Southern folk traditions. According to Professor Boyd, Zora was fiercely independent, refusing to conform to expectations for how black women writers should behave or what they should write about. She celebrated black vernacular and culture at a time when many black intellectuals were trying to distance themselves from rural Southern traditions. She wrote about sexuality and desire in ways that shocked many readers. She lived alone or with other women for most of her adult life, briefly marrying twice, but both times ending the marriages when they threatened her independence and her work. But according to Professor Boyd, Zora's independence came at enormous cost. She struggled financially throughout her life, often barely surviving, sometimes working as a maid between writing projects. The literary establishment that celebrated her male contemporaries largely ignored or dismissed her work during her lifetime. She died in poverty in 1960 and was buried in an unmarked grave in a segregated cemetery in Florida. It wasn't until the 1970s when writer Alice Walker searched for and found Zora's grave and marked it with a headstone that Zora's work began to be rediscovered and recognized as the brilliant contribution to American literature that it was. Zora Neale Hurston's story reveals the intersection of race, gender, and class in constraining women's independence. She faced discrimination as a black person that limited her economic opportunities and literary recognition. She faced discrimination as a woman that limited her authority and subjected her to different standards than male writers. She faced discrimination as a poor person that meant she had no safety net, no family wealth to fall back on when times were hard. Her independence was hard-won and constantly precarious, achieved through immense talent and determination, but never secure, never comfortable, never adequately recognized during her lifetime. Let me tell you about another form of women's independence that emerged in the early 20th century. The settlement house movement, where college-educated women created communities dedicated to social reform and lived together in working-class neighborhoods, serving those communities while also creating spaces for their own independence and professional work. Let me tell you about Jane Addams, who founded Hull House in Chicago in 1889 and who became one of the most famous social reformers in American history. Jane Addams was born in 1860, and according to research by Professor Louise W. Knight from Northwestern University, whose biography of Addams examines her life and work, Jane was part of the first generation of American women to attend college in significant numbers. But after graduating from Rockford Female Seminary, she faced the question that confronted many educated women of her generation. Now what? She couldn't pursue most professions. She didn't want to marry. She felt called to do meaningful work in the world, but Victorian society offered educated women very few outlets for their ambitions. Jane, along with her friend Ellen Gates Starr, founded Hull House, a settlement house in a poor immigrant neighborhood in Chicago. According to Professor Knight, Hull House became a center for social reform, offering education programs, childcare, healthcare, cultural activities, and advocacy for labor rights and social justice. But it was also essentially a community of women living together and governing themselves. Jane and Ellen lived at Hull House, along with many other educated women who came to live and work there, creating what was essentially an all-female community dedicated to social service and reform. According to Professor Knight, Jane Addams never married, and she lived for many years in what historians recognize as a Boston marriage with Mary Rosette Smith, a wealthy Chicago woman who supported Hull House financially and emotionally. Jane and Mary lived together, traveled together, and wrote intimate letters to each other that clearly express romantic love. Their relationship was known to their community and accepted within the relatively progressive circles that supported Hull House, though it was never publicly acknowledged as romantic during their lifetimes. Jane Addams became internationally famous, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931 for her work in social reform and pacifism. She wrote influential books about democracy, social ethics, and women's role in public life. She helped create the profession of social work and the field of sociology. According to Professor Knight, she did all this while living in a community of women, supported by her relationship with Mary Rosette Smith, never marrying a man or subordinating her work to male authority. She created a model of women's independence that combined professional achievement, social reform, intimate relationships with other women, and community living. But what is also important about Jane Addams's story, according to Professor Knight, is that her ability to do this work depended partly on her social class and education. Jane came from a relatively wealthy family and had access to education and social connections that working class women did not have. Her independence was made possible not just by her own abilities and determination, but by class privilege that gave her resources and options that poorer women lacked. The settlement house movement, while genuinely dedicated to helping the poor, was also a movement of privileged women creating spaces for their own independence and professional work. Now, let me tell you about women in non-Western contexts who navigated very different social structures to claim independence. Let me tell you about Kulthum, the Egyptian singer who lived from 1898 to 1975, and who became one of the most famous and powerful women in the Arab world, achieving a level of independence and public prominence that was extremely rare for women in her society. Kulthum was born in a small village in the Nile Delta to a poor family, and according to research by Professor Virginia Danielson from the University of Michigan, whose work on Kulthum examines her life and musical career, Kulthum began singing as a child, performing religious songs with her father. She was talented enough that by her teens she was performing in Cairo, the center of Egyptian musical life. She became a recording star in the 1920s, and by the 1930s was the most famous singer in the Arab world. According to Professor Danielson, Kulthum never married until late in life, and even then, the marriage seemed to be more about social respectability than genuine partnership. She lived independently, controlled her own career and finances, made her own artistic decisions, and wielded enormous influence in Egyptian cultural and political life. She performed for presidents and kings. She was consulted on matters of national importance. She commanded respect and deference from men who would never have given such respect to other women. Her independence was possible because her talent and fame gave her a form of power that transcended normal gender restrictions. But according to Professor Danielson, Kulthum had to be extremely careful about maintaining respectability. She dressed conservatively, always in the public eye appearing modest and dignified. She was careful about her public statements, avoiding controversial topics that might damage her reputation. She cultivated an image of herself as a nationalist and patriot, someone whose art served Egypt and the Arab world. She could be independent because her independence was seen as serving the nation rather than as a selfish pursuit of personal freedom. Her freedom was conditional, dependent on her continuing to fulfill certain expectations and to maintain a public image that was acceptable to conservative society. What Kulthum's story reveals is that in societies with strong restrictions on women's behaviour, exceptional talent or achievement could sometimes create space for individual women's independence, but that independence was always conditional, always requiring careful navigation of social expectations, always vulnerable to being revoked if the woman stepped too far outside accepted boundaries. Kulthum's independence was real, but it was also exhausting, requiring constant performance of respectability and patriotic devotion. Let me tell you about women who found independence through disability and through challenging social assumptions about what disabled women could do. Let me tell you about Helen Keller, who lived from 1880 to 1968, and who is usually remembered for overcoming blindness and deafness to learn to communicate, but whose adult life as an independent political activist, writer, and lecturer is less well known and equally remarkable. Helen Keller became deaf and blind as a young child from illness, and according to research by Professor Kim E. Nielsen from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, whose work on Helen Keller examines her political activism, Helen learned to communicate through the dedicated teaching of Anne Sullivan, and she went on to graduate from Radcliffe College, becoming the first deaf-blind person to earn a bachelor's degree. But what many people don't know is that Helen spent most of her adult life as a political activist, advocating for socialism, women's suffrage, labour rights and disability rights. According to Professor Nielsen, Helen lived with Anne Sullivan, and later with Anne's husband John Macy in what was essentially a three-way household, with Anne and Helen's relationship at the centre and John's somewhat peripheral. Helen never married, though she did have a romantic relationship with a young man when she was in her 30s, that her family broke up, believing that a deaf-blind woman shouldn't marry. After Anne Sullivan's death, Helen lived with Polly Thompson, another woman who became her companion and assistant, and they remained together until Polly's death. What makes Helen Keller's story so significant, according to Professor Nielsen, is that she refused to accept the limitations that society wanted to place on disabled women. She could have spent her life as an inspirational symbol, the deaf-blind girl who learned to communicate, a figure of pity and admiration, but not a full political agent. Instead, she became a radical political activist, advocating for causes that were controversial and unpopular. She spoke out for workers' rights against capitalism, for birth control, for women's suffrage. She used her fame to amplify her political message, and when that political message made people uncomfortable, they tried to dismiss her, claiming that she was being manipulated by others, that a deaf-blind woman couldn't really have her own political opinions. But according to Professor Nielsen, Helen's writings and speeches make clear that her political convictions were deeply held and carefully reasoned. She chose to live independently, to support herself through her writing and speaking, to live with women companions of her choosing, and to dedicate her life to social justice work that she believed in. Her disability made her independence more difficult in practical terms, requiring assistance with communication and daily living tasks. But it didn't prevent her independence, and her insistence on living as a full political and intellectual agent challenged assumptions about what disabled women could do and be. Now, let me tell you about contemporary women who are redefining what independence means in the digital age. Let me tell you about women who are using technology and social media to create new forms of economic independence and community that bypass traditional gatekeepers. According to research by Professor Nancy Baim from Microsoft Research, whose work on digital media examines online communities and creativity, the internet has created new possibilities for women's economic independence, allowing women to build businesses, audiences, and income streams without needing approval from traditional male-dominated institutions. Think about women content creators, bloggers, podcasters, YouTubers who have built audiences of millions and created 6- or 7-figure businesses without ever needing to convince a traditional publisher, producer, or investor to take a chance on them. Think about women who are using platforms like Patreon to get direct financial support from their audiences, allowing them to create the work they want to create, rather than having to compromise their vision to please advertisers or corporate sponsors. Think about women who are using social media to build communities of other independent women, sharing resources, advice, and mutual support in ways that echo the Beguines or the settlement house movement, but on a global digital scale. According to Professor Baim, this digital independence is real and transformative for many women, but it also comes with new vulnerabilities and challenges. Women content creators face online harassment at much higher rates than men do. They have to navigate constantly changing platform algorithms and policies that can destroy their businesses overnight. They face the precarity of being independent contractors without employee protections, healthcare, or retirement benefits. They deal with the pressure of having to constantly perform their lives and personalities for public consumption. The exhaustion of being always on, always creating, always engaging with audiences. And there is a deeper question about whether this digital independence is truly independent, or whether it is just a new form of dependence, now on tech platforms and algorithms, rather than on husbands or bosses. Professor Baim points out that women who build their businesses on platforms like YouTube, Instagram, or TikTok are dependent on those platforms continuing to exist and continuing to treat them fairly, and they have no power when platforms change their algorithms or policies in ways that hurt creators' ability to reach audiences and make money. The freedom is real but constrained. Independence achieved within systems controlled by large corporations that have their own agendas and interests. Let me tell you about something that contemporary researchers are discovering about women's independence and well-being. According to research by Professor Bella DePaulo, whose work on single life we discussed earlier, studies consistently show that single women are happier and healthier than married women, on average. Single women report higher life satisfaction, better health, more friendships, and stronger community connections than married women. They exercise more, eat better, have more active social lives, and are more engaged in their communities. The stereotype of the lonely, miserable single woman is not just inaccurate but backwards. On average, it is married women who are more isolated and less happy. Professor DiPaolo points out that this doesn't mean marriage makes all women unhappy, or that all single women are happy, but it does mean that the social narrative that women need marriage to be happy is empirically false. Many women thrive in independence, finding that living alone or living with other women gives them the freedom to structure their lives according to their own preferences, to pursue their own interests, to maintain friendships and community connections that marriage might constrain, and to make decisions based on their own needs rather than having to constantly negotiate and compromise with a partner. But here is what is fascinating and a bit disturbing about this research. According to Professor DiPaolo, when these findings are reported in media, they are usually framed negatively as evidence of marriage crisis, or as concerning rather than as good news that women are thriving in independence. The cultural commitment to the idea that women should want marriage is so strong that evidence that many women are happier without it is treated as a problem to be solved, rather than as validation of women's diverse needs and preferences. Think about that for a moment. We have empirical evidence that many women flourish in independence, that the independent lives women have fought for throughout history actually do lead to well-being and satisfaction for many women. And yet society still treats women's independence with suspicion, still pushes women toward marriage, still frames single women's lives as incomplete or sad, still resists the evidence that women's autonomy is valuable in itself, not just as a temporary state before marriage or as a unfortunate backup plan when marriage doesn't work out. Now let me tell you about the economic reality of women's independence today, because while legal barriers to women's independence have been removed in many countries, economic barriers remain substantial. According to research by Professor Ali Russell Hochschild from the University of California, Berkeley, whose work on gender and emotional labor examines women's economic challenges, women still earn less than men on average, are concentrated in lower-paying occupations, are penalized in the workplace for having or potentially having children, and do significantly more unpaid labor in households than men do. These economic realities make independence harder for women to achieve and maintain. Professor Hochschild points out that the contemporary situation is particularly frustrating because women have been told they can have it all, that they can be independent and have careers and also have families. But the reality is that workplaces are still structured around the assumption of a worker with a wife at home taking care of everything else. Women who want independence through career success face workplaces that penalize them for any sign that they might prioritize family. Women who want independence by living alone face economic discrimination that makes it harder for them to rent apartments, buy homes, and build wealth. Women who want both work and family find themselves doing what Hochschild calls the second shift, working full-time in paid labor and then coming home to do most of the housework and childcare. The legal right to independence is not the same as the practical ability to achieve independence, according to Professor Hochschild. Women today have freedoms that the women we've discussed tonight never had, but they also face economic pressures that make those freedoms difficult to exercise. The promise of equality hasn't been fulfilled when workplaces, social policies, and economic structures continue to disadvantage women, and particularly women who choose to live independently. Let me tell you about an important concept that feminist thinkers have developed to describe what we've been discussing tonight. It is called patriarchal bargaining, and it was articulated by anthropologist Denise Candioti to describe how women navigate systems of male dominance, making strategic choices about how to resist, comply with, or manipulate patriarchal structures to maximize their freedom and well-being within the constraints they face. Every woman we've discussed tonight was engaged in patriarchal bargaining, making choices about how to claim independence within societies that restricted women's autonomy. Some women, like the Beguines or Jane Addams, created all-female communities that operated somewhat outside patriarchal family structures. Some women, like Hortensia or Mary Catherine Goddard, used wealth or position to claim independence that other women couldn't access. Some women, like Hildegard of Bingen or Sor Juana in Stella Cruz, used religious institutions to gain education and authority while accepting the constraints that those institutions imposed. Some women, like Alice James, used illness to opt out of social expectations. Some women, like Hannah Leon Owens, fabricated identities that gave them the social standing they needed to be independent. Some women, like Flora Tristan and Zora Neale Hurston, fought openly and paid tremendous costs for their independence. None of these choices were perfect. All involved compromises, costs, and limitations, but all of them represented women's agency, women's refusal to completely accept the restrictions society placed on them, women's determination to claim as much freedom and autonomy as they possibly could within the constraints they faced. And collectively, these individual choices changed what was possible, expanded the boundaries of acceptable female behaviour, and created the space for future women's greater freedom. As we truly come to the end of tonight's journey, I want you to understand something fundamental. The story of women who lived alone without men is not a marginal story, not a footnote to real history, not a collection of exceptions and oddities. It is a central story of human freedom and human dignity. It is the story of half of humanity fighting for the right to exist as full persons, not as the property or dependents of the other half. It is the story of how societies try to control and constrain people, and how people resist and find ways to live authentic lives despite those controls. Every freedom you have, regardless of your gender, was built by people who fought for autonomy, who insisted that they had the right to make their own choices, who refused to accept that their lives should be determined by social convention or tradition or others' expectations. The women we've met tonight were freedom fighters, not in the sense of waging war, but in the sense of insisting on their full humanity, their right to think, to create, to love, to work, to live according to their own values and desires, and their fight continues. Women's independence is still contested, still constrained, still met with social disapproval and economic disadvantage in many parts of the world. The backlash against women's independence is real and ongoing, as evidenced by laws restricting women's reproductive freedom, by workplace discrimination, by online harassment of women who speak out, by continued stigmatization of women who choose to remain single or who live with other women. The freedom that women have gained is not secure, not inevitable, not something that can be taken for granted. Every generation has to defend it, extend it, and fight for it anew. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to carry these stories with you. I want you to remember Marjorie Kempe walking across Europe, Hortensia speaking in the Roman Forum, thousands of Beguines governing themselves, Mary Patton commanding a ship, Flora Tristan advocating for workers despite assassination attempts, Zora Neale Hurston writing beautiful novels while working as a maid, Jane Addams building Hull House, Kulthum commanding stages across the Arab world, Helen Keller speaking out for radical political change. Remember that these women existed, that they mattered, that they changed the world, that they made your freedom possible. And remember that you are part of this story. Every choice you make about how to live your life, every time you support or question someone else's choices, every time you resist social pressure or challenge restrictions, you are participating in this ongoing human struggle for autonomy and self-determination. The question is not whether you will be part of this story, but what role you will play in it. Thank you for spending this evening with me, exploring these remarkable lives and thinking about what independence means. I hope you found inspiration in these women's courage, insight in their struggles, and hope in their achievements. I hope you've gained a deeper understanding of how hard-won women's current freedoms are, and how vigilant we need to be in defending and extending them. But there are still more stories I want to share with you tonight, because every woman's path to independence was unique. And the more we explore these diverse experiences, the more we understand that there is no single way to be an independent woman, no one right path to autonomy. Let me tell you about women who found independence in unexpected places, through unexpected means, in times and cultures where independence seemed impossible. Let me tell you about Sei Sheinagon, a Japanese woman who lived over 1,000 years ago, from around 966 to 1017 CE, during the Heian period. According to research by Professor Ivan Morris from Columbia University, whose work on the world of the Shining Prince examines Heian court culture, Sei Sheinagon was a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court who wrote one of the most famous works of Japanese literature, the Pillow Book, a collection of observations, lists, anecdotes, and poetry that reveals a sharp, witty, deeply intelligent woman living a life of remarkable independence within the confined world of the imperial court. Sei Sheinagon was married, but according to Professor Morris, her marriage was essentially separate from her court life. She lived at court, served the empress, and pursued her literary work independently of her husband. This was possible in Heian Japan, where aristocratic marriages were often visiting arrangements, with husbands visiting wives at their residences, rather than wives moving into husbands' households. Women of the aristocracy retained their own residences, their own property, and significant autonomy. Sei Sheinagon used this cultural arrangement to create a life centered on her intellectual and literary pursuits, rather than on wifely duties. According to Professor Morris, the Pillow Book reveals a woman of fierce independence of mind. Sei Sheinagon wrote exactly what she thought, with a sharp tongue and no apparent concern for whether her opinions would offend. She criticized people she found boring or stupid, regardless of their rank. She celebrated beauty, elegance, and wit. She described her own romantic encounters with remarkable frankness. She created lists of things she loved and hated, her preferences and observations about court life, that reveal a woman who trusted her own judgment and felt no need to defer to male authority in matters of taste or opinion. What makes Sei Sheinagon's story so significant is that she found intellectual independence within a highly structured court system, creating space for her own voice and vision within constraints that could have silenced her. According to Professor Morris, women writers of the Heian period, including Sei Sheinagon and her contemporary Murasaki Shikibu, who wrote The Tale of Genji, produced some of the greatest works of Japanese literature precisely because they wrote in vernacular Japanese rather than in Chinese, which was the language of official male scholarship excluded from official male literary culture. These women created their own literary tradition that proved far more enduring and influential than most of the Chinese language poetry that male courtiers produced. Now let me tell you about Christine de Pizan, a medieval European writer who lived from 1364 to 1430, and who became one of the first women in Europe to support herself entirely through writing. Christine's story is remarkable not just for her achievement, but for how she came to her independence through tragedy and necessity. According to research by Professor Charity Cannon-Willard from Ladcliffe College, whose work on Christine de Pizan examines her life and writings, Christine was born in Venice but raised in France, where her father served as the court astrologer to King Charles V. She received an excellent education, unusual for a girl, because her father believed in educating daughters as well as sons. Christine married at 15 to a court secretary, and by all accounts it was a happy marriage. But when Christine was 25, her husband died suddenly, leaving her a widow with 3 young children, a mother to support, and no income. According to Professor Willard, this was a catastrophic situation for a woman in medieval France. Christine could have remarried, which was the expected solution, but she chose instead to support her family through writing, becoming one of the first professional women writers in European history. Christine wrote poetry, prose, and scholarly works on topics ranging from chivalry to military strategy to women's education. She wrote biographies of French kings and treatises on political philosophy, but her most famous work, according to Professor Willard, is the Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1405, which is essentially a defense of women against the misogynistic writers of her time, who argued that women were intellectually and morally inferior to men. In this work, Christine imagined a city populated entirely by accomplished women from history and mythology, demonstrating through example after example that women were capable of the same virtues, intelligence, and achievements as men. According to Professor Willard, the Book of the City of Ladies is one of the earliest feminist texts in European literature. Christine systematically refuted the arguments of male writers who claimed women were naturally inferior, using historical evidence, logical argument, and her own experience as a successful writer and scholar. She argued that women's apparent lack of achievement was due to lack of education and opportunity, not lack of capability. She insisted that women deserved the same access to learning that men had, and she did all this while supporting herself and her family through her writing, proving through her own life that women could achieve intellectual and economic independence. But according to Professor Willard, Christine had to be strategic about how she presented herself and her arguments. She couldn't afford to alienate potential patrons by being too radical. She framed her defenses of women in terms that were acceptable to her medieval Christian audience, emphasizing women's moral virtue and spiritual worth, rather than demanding political or legal equality. She was engaged in what we might now call strategic feminism, pushing boundaries, but not so far that she would lose her audience and her ability to support herself through writing. Let me tell you about a woman who lived in a very different context, but faced similar challenges of claiming independence through intellectual work. Her name was Sor Juana in a Fay La Cruz. And wait, I've already told you about Sor Juana earlier. Let me tell you instead about Maria Sibylla Merian, a German naturalist and scientific illustrator who lived from 1647 to 1717 and who became one of the most important early entomologists through her groundbreaking observations of insect metamorphosis. According to research by Professor Natalie Zeman-Davis from Princeton University, whose work on women on the margins examines women's lives in early modern Europe, Maria Sibylla Merian was trained as an artist by her stepfather and developed a particular interest in studying and illustrating insects, especially their life cycles and metamorphosis. This was revolutionary scientific work. In the 17th century, most people believed that insects spontaneously generated from mud or rotting matter. Merian's careful observations proved that insects underwent predictable life cycles, with caterpillars transforming into butterflies and moths through metamorphosis. Merian married and had 2 daughters, but according to Professor Davis, the marriage was unhappy. In 1685, Merian made a radical decision. She left her husband and joined a Labadist religious community in the Netherlands, a Protestant sect that lived communally and allowed women considerable independence. Merian lived in this community for several years, continuing her scientific observations and illustrations. When the community began to decline, she moved to Amsterdam with her daughters and established herself as an independent naturalist and artist. But here is where Merian's story becomes truly extraordinary. In 1699, at age 52, Merian decided she needed to study tropical insects to expand her scientific work. According to Professor Davis, she sold everything she owned, took her younger daughter with her, and sailed to Suriname, a Dutch colony in South America. For 2 years she lived in Suriname, exploring the jungle, observing and collecting insects, making detailed illustrations of tropical species that European scientists had never seen. She worked with indigenous and enslaved people who taught her about local plants and animals, acknowledging their knowledge in her published work at a time when most European scientists ignored or appropriated indigenous knowledge. without credit. Marian returned to Amsterdam in 1701 and published Metamorphosis Insectorum Serenamensium, a lavishly illustrated book documenting her observations of Surinamese insects and plants. According to Professor Davis, this work was groundbreaking both scientifically and artistically. It established Marian as one of the leading naturalists of her era and influenced the development of entomology for generations. She had achieved scientific recognition and independence through sheer determination, careful observation, artistic skill, and willingness to take extraordinary risks, including travelling alone to a tropical colony at an age when most people would never have attempted such a journey. What Marian's story reveals is that sometimes women's independence required not just resisting social expectations, but actively adventuring into spaces where social expectations didn't reach. Marian went to Suriname partly because in that colonial frontier, the rigid gender restrictions of European society were somewhat relaxed. She could explore, observe, and work with a freedom that she couldn't have had in Amsterdam or Germany. She used the margins of empire, the spaces where European social order was incomplete, to claim space for her scientific work. Now, let me tell you about women who found independence through education, specifically women who fought for access to higher education when universities were closed to women. Let me tell you about Sofia Kovalevskaya, a Russian mathematician who lived from 1850 to 1891 and who became the first woman in Europe to obtain a doctorate in mathematics and the first woman to be appointed to a full professorship at a European university. Sofia was born in Moscow to an aristocratic family, and according to research by Professor Anne Hibner-Koblitz from Arizona State University, whose biography of Kovalevskaya examines her mathematical career, Sofia showed exceptional mathematical talent from childhood. But Russian universities did not admit women, and women were not allowed to travel abroad without permission from a husband or father. So, at 18, Sofia entered into a fictitious marriage with a young paleontologist named Vladimir Kovalevsky. The marriage was meant to be purely practical, allowing Sofia to travel to Germany to study mathematics, while Vladimir pursued his own scientific work. According to Professor Koblitz, Sofia studied at the University of Heidelberg and then at the University of Berlin, though she couldn't officially enroll because the university didn't admit women. She studied privately with the mathematician Karl Weierstrass, one of the leading mathematicians of the era, who recognized her exceptional talent. In 1874, Sofia obtained her doctorate from the University of Göttingen, summa cum laude, based on 3 papers of such high quality that the university waived the usual requirement that she appear in person to defend her dissertation. She was the first woman to receive a doctorate in mathematics from a European university. But according to Professor Koblitz, having a doctorate didn't immediately lead to an academic position. No university would hire a woman professor. Sofia spent years without an academic job, her brilliant mathematical mind essentially unemployed. During this period, her marriage to Vladimir, which had started as a formality, became a real relationship. They had a daughter, and Sofia tried to balance motherhood with her desire to continue mathematical research. But Vladimir became involved in fraudulent business schemes and committed suicide in 1883, leaving Sofia a widow with a young daughter to support. Sofia's tragedy became, paradoxically, her liberation. According to Professor Koblitz, after Vladimir's death, Sofia threw herself into mathematics with renewed intensity. In 1884, she was appointed to a position at Stockholm University, becoming the first woman to hold a full professorship at a European university. She did groundbreaking work on partial differential equations, was awarded the Prix Bordin from the French Academy of Sciences for her work on the rotation of solid bodies, and became a celebrated figure in European mathematical circles. She achieved, finally, the recognition that her mathematical talent deserved, though she had to overcome extraordinary obstacles of gender discrimination and personal tragedy to get there. What makes Sofia Kovalevskaya's story so powerful is that she never gave up on her mathematical work despite years of being unable to find employment despite her doctorate and proven ability. According to Professor Koblitz, Sophia understood that as a woman mathematician, she had to be not just good but exceptional to be recognized at all. She had to prove herself over and over again, meeting higher standards than male mathematicians faced. And even when she achieved recognition, she faced constant questioning of whether she was really capable of the work she was doing, or whether she was somehow receiving help from male colleagues. Her independence as a scholar was hard-won and constantly challenged. Let me tell you about a completely different form of women's independence, one rooted in working-class women's economic survival, rather than in intellectual or artistic achievement. Let me tell you about the factory girls of Lowell, Massachusetts. In the 1830s and 1840s, thousands of young women who left their families' farms to work in textile mills and who created a remarkable, if brief, period of women's economic and cultural independence. According to research by Professor Thomas Dublin from Binghamton University, whose work on women at work examines the Lowell Mill Girls, the textile mills in Lowell recruited young women from New England farming families, offering them wages that were extraordinary by the standards of the time. A mill girl could earn more in a year of factory work than she could earn in several years of teaching or domestic service, the only other jobs typically available to young women. Thousands of women came to Lowell, lived in boarding houses run by the mill companies, worked long hours in the mills, and sent money home to their families while saving for their own futures. But, according to Professor Dublin, what is remarkable about the Lowell Mill Girls is not just that they earned wages, but what they did with their independence. They created a vibrant cultural and intellectual life. They founded a magazine called The Lowell Offering, where they published their own poetry, essays, and stories. They attended lectures and concerts. They formed reading groups and improvement societies. They wrote letters and diaries that reveal young women excited by their independence, enjoying the chance to live away from their families, to make their own money, to make their own decisions about how to spend their time and their earnings. One mill girl, Harriet Hanson Robinson, wrote in her memoir, analysed by Professor Dublin, about the thrill of receiving her first wages at age 10, money that was hers to spend as she chose. She described the freedom of living in the boarding house with other young women, the conversations and friendships, the sense of independence that came from earning her own living. She wrote that the mill girls were living the same sort of life that hundreds of young men were already living in cities, meaning that they had achieved a kind of independence that was typically reserved for young men. But according to Professor Dublin, this independence was fragile and temporary. The mill owners recruited young women precisely because they could pay them less than they would have to pay men. As the textile industry became more competitive, working conditions in the mills deteriorated, wages fell, hours increased, and the initial promise of the mill work faded. Many of the mill girls worked for only a few years before marrying or returning to their families. The independence they experienced was real but brief, a window of opportunity that opened and then closed as economic conditions changed. Yet even this brief period had lasting impact, according to Professor Dublin. The mill girls learned that they could support themselves, that they could live independently, that they had capabilities beyond domestic work. Some of them became active in labour organising and in the early women's rights movement. Their experience of economic independence, however temporary, gave them a vision of what was possible for women, and some of them spent the rest of their lives working to expand opportunities for other women. Let me tell you about women who found independence through religious innovation, creating new forms of religious life that gave them authority and autonomy. Let me tell you about Anne Lee, the founder of the Shakers, who lived from 1736 to 1784 and who created one of the most successful utopian religious communities in American history, a community based on celibacy, gender equality, and communal living that gave women unprecedented religious authority. Anne Lee was born in Manchester, England, to a working-class family, and according to research by Professor Stephen J. Stein from Indiana University, whose work on the Shaker experience examines their history and theology, Anne worked in textile mills and as a cook before joining a religious group called the Shaking Quakers, known for their ecstatic worship services involving shaking and dancing in tongues. Anne married and had 4 children, all of whom died in infancy or early childhood. According to Shaker tradition, these deaths convinced Anne that sexuality itself was the root of human suffering and sin. Anne had a vision, according to Professor Stein, in which she saw that salvation required complete celibacy and separation from the sinful world. She began preaching that Christ had returned to earth in female form, embodied in her, and that the millennium was beginning. This was an extraordinary claim, asserting not just religious authority but divine incarnation for a woman. In 1774, Anne and a small group of followers emigrated to America, where they established a community in upstate New York based on celibacy, communal property, confession of sins, and equality between men and women. The Shaker communities that grew from Anne Lee's teaching were, according to Professor Stein, remarkable experiments in gender equality. Shaker communities had parallel male and female leadership, with women governing women's work and men governing men's work, and major decisions made jointly. Women and men ate in separate dining rooms, slept in separate dormitories, and performed gender-specific work. But they were considered spiritually equal, both capable of holding religious authority and receiving divine revelation. Women could be ministers and elders, positions of real power within Shaker communities. For women who joined the Shakers, according to Professor Stein, the community offered a form of independence that was otherwise almost impossible to achieve in 18th and 19th century America. They didn't have to marry or bear children. They lived in communities governed partly by women. They could hold positions of religious and administrative authority. They had economic security, with the community providing for all their needs. They were freed from the endless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and childcare that consumed most women's lives and often led to early death. But this independence came at a cost. According to Professor Stein, Shakers had to give up sexuality, romantic love, and biological motherhood. They had to surrender individual property and follow the community's strict rules about dress, behavior, and worship. They lived lives of intense labor and simple living, and the Shaker movement, dependent on converts since members didn't have children, gradually declined over the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, only a handful of Shakers remain, the last survivors of a movement that once numbered thousands. The independence they offered was real, but came with restrictions that fewer and fewer women were willing to accept as other paths to independence opened up. Let me tell you about women who found independence through performance and entertainment, fields that were both stigmatized and liberating. Let me tell you about Josephine Baker, who lived from 1906 to 1975, and who became one of the most famous entertainers in the world, achieving a level of independence, celebrity, and wealth that was almost unimaginable for a black woman of her era. Josephine was born in St. Louis, Missouri, into poverty, and according to research by Professor Benetta Jules Rosette from the University of California, San Diego, whose work on Josephine Baker examines her life and cultural impact. Josephine left home as a young teenager and joined a traveling vaudeville troupe. She made her way to New York, performed in Harlem nightclubs, and in 1925, at age 19, went to Paris to perform in a revue called Le Revuement de Grèce. Paris in the 1920s was fascinated with jazz, with African-American culture, with what they saw as exotic and primitive. Josephine's performances, which included provocative dances and famously wearing a costume made of artificial bananas, made her an overnight sensation. According to Professor Jules Rosette, Josephine became incredibly famous and wealthy. She performed at the Folies Bergère, one of Paris's most prestigious venues. She made films, recorded music, and became a fashion icon. She bought a chateau in the French countryside. She had lovers of both sexes, though she married several times for various practical reasons. She lived openly and flamboyantly, doing exactly as she pleased with a freedom that was extraordinary for any woman of her era and almost unthinkable for a black woman from a poor American background. But Josephine also used her fame for purposes beyond entertainment. According to Professor Jules Rosette, during World War II, she worked for the French resistance, using her celebrity as cover to carry secret messages for the resistance movement. After the war, she became active in the American civil rights movement, refusing to perform for segregated audiences when she toured the United States and speaking at the March on Washington. Alongside Martin Luther King Jr., she adopted 12 children from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, creating what she called her Rainbow Tribe, to demonstrate that people of all races could live together harmoniously. What makes Josephine Baker's story so complex is the question of whether her independence was liberation or exploitation. According to Professor Jules Rosette, Josephine's performances in the 1920s played into racist stereotypes about black women as exotic, primitive, and sexually available. She was celebrated by white audiences partly because she confirmed their prejudices. Yet Josephine herself seemed to understand this and to use it strategically, playing the role that audiences wanted while using the money and fame it brought her to build a life of extraordinary independence and to advocate for racial justice. Josephine never returned to live in the United States, choosing to remain in France, where, despite racism, she faced less discrimination than she would have in Jim Crow America. She lived as an independent woman, supporting herself through her performances, making her own decisions about her work and her personal life, using her platform to advocate for causes she believed in. According to Professor Jules Rosette, Josephine's independence was achieved partly through performing a version of blackness and femininity for white audiences, a complicated bargain that brought her freedom at the cost of perpetuating stereotypes. Yet she remains a powerful example of how women, particularly women of colour, have had to navigate complex and often exploitative systems to claim any independence at all. Now let me tell you about women who found independence through political revolution and activism. Let me tell you about Chu Jin, a Chinese revolutionary who lived from 1875 to 1907 and who became one of the most important early feminists in China, advocating for women's education and rights, while also working to overthrow the Qing dynasty. Chu Jin was born into a wealthy family and received an education unusual for Chinese girls of her era. According to research by Professor Louise Edwards from the University of New South Wales, whose work on women warriors examines Chu Jin's life and writings, Chu Jin was married in an arranged marriage at age 21 and had 2 children. But she was deeply unhappy in the marriage, feeling constrained by traditional expectations for women. In 1904, she made a radical decision. She left her husband and children and went to Japan to study, joining the community of Chinese students and revolutionaries who were plotting to overthrow the Qing dynasty and modernize China. In Japan, according to Professor Edwards, Chu Jin began dressing in men's clothing, practicing martial arts, and writing revolutionary poetry and essays. She founded a women's magazine, advocating for women's education and rights. She argued that China could never be strong while half its population women were kept uneducated and bound by foot binding and other oppressive customs. She called for women to be educated, to participate in public life, to have the same opportunities as men. Her writings were passionate and powerful, calling Chinese women to awaken from centuries of oppression. Chu Jin returned to China in 1906 and became involved in planning an armed uprising against the Qing government. According to Professor Edwards, she established a school that was actually a front for military training. In 1907, the Qing authorities discovered the plot. Chu Jin was arrested, tortured, and executed by beheading at age 32. Her last words, according to historical records, were a poem she wrote in prison about her willingness to sacrifice her life for the cause of revolution and women's rights. Chu Jin became a martyr for both the revolutionary movement and the feminist movement in China, according to Professor Edwards. Her life demonstrated that Chinese women could be revolutionaries, could fight and die for political causes, could be more than just daughters, wives, and mothers. She chose independence and political action over conventional marriage and motherhood, and she paid for that choice with her life. Yet her example inspired generations of Chinese feminists who followed her. Let me tell you about women who found independence in old age after lifetimes of subordination. This is a story that is often overlooked, but according to research by Professor Lois Banner from the University of Southern California, whose work on aging examines women's later lives, widowhood in old age sometimes brought women a freedom they had never experienced in their youth or middle age. After decades of marriage, after children were raised, after husbands died, some women found that old age brought a kind of independence that society couldn't easily take away. Let me tell you about Anna Mary Robertson Moses, better known as Grandma Moses, who lived from 1860 to 1961 and who became one of America's most beloved folk artists, but who didn't start painting seriously until she was in her 70s. Grandma Moses spent her entire adult life as a farm wife, married at age 27 to a farmer, raising 10 children, 5 of whom survived to adulthood, working on the farm, doing endless domestic labour. According to art historians, she did some embroidery as a hobby, but had no time or opportunity to pursue art seriously while raising children and managing a farm household. Her husband died in 1927 when Anna Mary was 67. She continued living on the farm with one of her sons and his family, but gradually her responsibilities lessened as she aged. In her mid-70s, arthritis made embroidery difficult, so she switched to painting, which was easier on her hands. She painted scenes from her memory of rural life, farm landscapes, seasonal activities, childhood memories. She gave her paintings to friends and family and sold a few at local fairs. Then, in 1938, when she was 78 years old, an art collector named Louis Caldor discovered her paintings in a drugstore window in upstate New York. He was captivated by their naive charm and vivid colours. He bought all the paintings he could find and began promoting her work to galleries and museums. By 1940, Grandma Moses was having shows in New York galleries. By the 1950s, she was nationally famous. Her paintings reproduced on greeting cards and calendars, her face on the cover of Time magazine. She continued painting until shortly before her death at age 101, producing over 1,500 paintings in her final 3 decades. What makes Grandma Moses' story so significant is that her artistic career, her independence as an artist, her fame and success all came after age 75, after a lifetime of domestic labour with no time for artistic pursuits. Widowhood and old age gave her the freedom to pursue painting. The fact that she was an elderly grandmother made her success acceptable in ways that it might not have been if she had been a young woman abandoning domestic responsibilities to pursue art. She could paint precisely because she had already fulfilled her obligations as wife and mother, because she was past the age when society had strong expectations about how she should spend her time. According to Professor Banner, Grandma Moses' story represents a pattern that was common before the modern era. Many women experienced their greatest freedom and independence in old age, after husbands died and children were grown. Older widows had social status that came from age authority over their households, freedom from childbearing and the sexual vulnerability of youth, and often control over property. They were past the age when they were viewed primarily as sexual and reproductive beings, and this could paradoxically bring a kind of freedom, an ability to act in the world without the constraints that bound younger women. But this late-life independence came only after decades of subordination, only after women had spent their youth and middle age serving others. It was independence earned through a lifetime of service, granted only when women were no longer considered sexually or reproductively valuable. It was better than no independence at all, but it represents the cruelty of systems that denied women autonomy during the years when they had the most energy and potential, giving them freedom only when they were old and tired. Let me tell you about one more woman. And this is a contemporary story that brings us full circle to the questions we started with tonight. Let me tell you about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, the Nigerian writer born in 1977, whose work explores themes of feminism, identity, and independence. and whose own life represents a modern negotiation of independence, marriage, motherhood, and career. According to interviews and her own writings, Chimamanda grew up in Nigeria, moved to the United States for university, and became a successful novelist, winning major literary awards for books like Half of a Yellow Sunday and Americana. She has written powerful essays about feminism, including We Should All Be Feminists, which has become a foundational text for contemporary feminism. She has spoken eloquently about the ways that society constrains women and the importance of women's independence and self-determination. But Chimamanda has also written about the complexities of being a feminist who chooses marriage and motherhood, about the ways that even successful, independent women face expectations and judgments about their personal choices. She has described the pressure she felt to marry, the questions people asked about when she would have children, the assumptions people made that her success must make her lonely, or that she must be difficult, or that she couldn't really be happy without a husband and children. Chimamanda eventually did marry and have a child, but on her own terms and timeline, and she has written about the importance of women being able to make these choices freely, without social pressure, without judgment, without assumptions that there is only one right way to be a woman. She has emphasized that feminism should be about expanding choices, not about prescribing one correct path. Whether a woman chooses to marry or not, to have children or not, to live alone or with others, what matters is that she has the freedom to choose and that her choice is respected. What Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's work and life remind us is that the conversation about women's independence continues. The specific obstacles have changed. Women in many countries now have legal rights that the women we've discussed tonight could never have imagined. But social pressure, economic inequality, cultural expectations, and gendered assumptions about women's proper roles continue to constrain women's choices. The freedom to live independently, to make choices based on one's own needs and desires, rather than on social expectations or male authority, remains incomplete and contested. As we truly come to the close of tonight's journey, I want you to understand that we've travelled through more than 1,000 years of women's history, across multiple continents and cultures, through aristocratic courts and factory floors, through convents and frontier homesteads, through artistic salons and revolutionary movements. And everywhere we've looked, we've found women seeking independence, creating it in whatever ways were available to them, paying whatever costs were demanded, insisting on their right to exist as full human beings with their own thoughts, desires, and purposes. These women were not exceptional in their desire for independence. That desire is universal, part of what it means to be human. What was exceptional were the obstacles they faced, and the creativity, courage, and determination they showed in overcoming or navigating those obstacles. They were ordinary women responding to extraordinary constraints, finding whatever cracks in the system they could slip through, whatever ways they could claim space for themselves. And what their stories teach us is that independence is not a luxury or a selfish pursuit. It is a fundamental human need as essential as food or shelter or love. People cannot flourish when they are entirely subordinated to others, when they have no say in their own lives, when their purposes and desires are completely suppressed in service of others' needs and wants. Women's fight for independence has always been a fight for basic human dignity, for the right to exist as whole persons, rather than as the property or dependence of men. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to carry these stories with you. I want you to remember Marjorie Kempe walking across Europe, Hortensia speaking in the Roman Forum, thousands of Beguines governing themselves, Mary Patton commanding a ship, Flora Tristan advocating for workers despite assassination attempts, Zora Neale Hurston writing beautiful novels while working as a maid, Jane Addams building Hull House, Kulthum commanding stages across the Arab world, Helen Keller speaking out for radical political change. Remember Saye Shaynagon writing her observations of Heian court life, Christine de Pizan supporting her family through writing in medieval France, Maria Sibylla Merian exploring the jungles of Suriname, At 52, Sofia Kovalevskaya, solving mathematical problems, stumped her male colleagues, the Lowell Mill Girls, creating their literary magazine, Anne Lee founding the Shakers, Josephine Baker performing in Paris while working for the resistance, Chu Jin sacrificing her life for revolution and women's rights, Grandma Moses painting her memories in her 70s, and beyond. Remember that these women existed, that they mattered, that they changed the world, that they made your freedom possible. Remember that independence is not given but taken, not granted but claimed, not a gift but a right that must be constantly defended and extended. Remember that you are part of this story, that your choices matter, that how you live your life and how you support or question others. Choices participates in this ongoing human struggle for autonomy and dignity. Sweet dreams, and may you wake tomorrow with gratitude for your freedom, compassion for those who lack it, and determination to protect and extend autonomy for everyone, regardless of gender, who seeks to live life on their own terms. Sleep well knowing that you are part of a long history of people fighting for independence and self-determination, and that your choices today help determine what freedoms will exist tomorrow. Good night, dear friends, and remember that the truth about women who lived alone without men is not that they were sad or incomplete, but that they were pioneers of freedom, and their courage made your freedom possible.